the fact that we get to play and love what we do, and someone takes that and puts it in their own sense, and then they get their whole audience pumped up for their team to play.
At 66, James Hetfield has outlived the whiskey, the wreckage, and most of the competition. But he hasn't forgotten the faces that made his life a living hell on the road.
It was pretty difficult at the beginning to work the logistics out, so it could be a co-headlining kind of thing. And even though they were going on last.
For Metallica, touring wasn't just about playing music. It was a psychological war zone where egos collided at 120 decibels. From riot-inducing divas to lip-syncing glam kings, these are the 5 bands that turned the Dream No More lifestyle into a total nightmare for the Kings of Thrash. Guns N' Roses. If you want to talk about the absolute blueprint for a tour from hell, you have to start with the 1992 Guns N' Roses and Metallica Stadium run. This wasn't just a concert series, it was a collision of 2 completely different solar systems. On one side, you had Metallica, the military of metal. These guys showed up on time, played their hearts out, and lived by a blue-collar work ethic. On the other side, you had Guns N' Roses, led by Axl Rose, who at the time was the most volatile, unpredictable, and frankly, exhausting figure in rock history. To James Hetfield, who was already dealing with the massive pressure of the Black Album's success, touring with GNR felt like being forced to babysit a group of toddlers who happened to own flamethrowers. The friction started almost immediately. You see, Metallica was used to the thrash metal code. You respect the fans, you respect the clock, and you give 100% until you're bleeding. But the 1992 tour was defined by Axl time. Metallica would finish their blistering set, ready to head back to the hotel or grab a drink, only to find out that Axl hadn't even arrived at the stadium yet. James and Lars would be sitting in locker rooms for 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours, listening to the crowd grow restless and angry. For a guy like Hetfield, who prizes authenticity and the bond with the fans above all else, this was a slap in the face. He didn't just hate the weight. He hated the arrogance behind it. He viewed Axl's behavior as a total betrayal of the rock and roll contract. The breaking point, the moment this beef turned into a legendary disaster, happened on August 8, 1992, at the Olympic Stadium in Montreal. During Metallica's opening set, a pyrotechnics cue went horribly wrong. James walked right into a 12-foot flame. He suffered 2nd and 3rd-degree burns across his body. The show stopped. The crowd was stunned. James was rushed to the hospital in agonizing pain, wondering if he'd ever play guitar again. Now, under any normal circumstances, the co-headliner would see this tragedy and think, I need to go out there early, save the night, and give these fans something to cheer for. But this was Axl Rose. Instead of stepping up, Axl made the crowd wait for hours. When he finally did take the stage, he complained about the sound quality, claimed his throat hurt, and walked off after just a few songs. The resulting riot in Montreal was catastrophic. Cars were overturned, fires were set, and the stadium was trashed. While James was literally lying in a hospital bed with his skin peeling off, Axl was the reason the city was burning. From that day on, the hate wasn't just about tardiness, it was about character. James later joked in interviews that the G in GNR stood for gently because of how delicate Axl seemed compared to the iron-willed Metallica crew. To understand why this feud was so deep, you have to look at where Guns N' Roses was as a band. They were at the peak of their Use Your Illusion era, a period of massive musical ambition but total internal decay. While Metallica was tightening their grip on the world with a no-nonsense attitude, GNR was bloating. They had horn sections, backup singers, and a frontman who changed outfits 10 times a night. For the 4 guys in Metallica who still wore the same sweaty black t-shirts every night, GNR looked like everything they hated about the rock star myth. They weren't just two bands on a bill, they were two different philosophies of life. The career of Guns N' Roses after that tour is a study in what happens when that ego-first mentality wins. They spent the next decade falling apart, with Axl retreating into the infamous Chinese democracy sessions that took 15 years to finish. Meanwhile, Metallica used the GNR disaster as a lesson. It hardened them. It made them realize that they never wanted to be the diva band. They saw the chaos of the GNR camp, the late starts, the cancelled shows, the disrespect for the crew, and they ran in the opposite direction toward corporate efficiency. That 1992 tour is the reason Metallica rarely shares the co-headlining title with anyone else. They learned the hard way that when you share the stage with a band that hates the clock as much as Axl Rose does, you're the one who ends up getting burned. It was a masterclass in professional friction. A summer spent in the company of a band they couldn't wait to leave in the rearview mirror. By the time the tour ended, Metallica wasn't just the biggest band in the world, they were the most disciplined, fueled by a deep-seated desire to never, ever be like Guns N' Roses. While the 1992 chaos with Axl was a clash of work ethics, Metallica's next great rivalry was a full-blown culture war against the glitter and hairspray of this band, Motley Crue. If the 1992 disaster with Guns N' Roses was a clash of work ethics, the long-standing friction between Metallica and Motley Crue was a full-blown culture war over the very soul of heavy metal. To understand why James Hetfield and the boys couldn't stand the Crue, you have to look at the geography of the 80s. You had the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles, which was all about leopard print, hairspray, and girls, girls, girls. And then you had the Bay Area thrash scene, which was all about denim, leather, and kill 'em all. From day one, Metallica viewed the glam metal movement not just as a different genre, but as a fraudulent infection that was ruining the music they loved. To James, Motley Crue represented the fake side of the industry, the kind of band that spent more time in the makeup chair than in the rehearsal room. The tension between these two camps wasn't just about fashion, it was about the fundamental concept of authenticity. Metallica prided themselves on being the anti-glam band. They didn't do music videos initially, they didn't have power ballads on their first 3 albums, and they certainly didn't wear eyeliner. Motley Crue, on the other hand, was the circus come to town. While they shared festival bills like the legendary Monsters of Rock, the backstage vibes were ice cold. Metallica fans would show up to throw bottles at hair bands, and James and Lars were right there with them in spirit. For Metallica, touring in proximity to the Crue felt like being forced to attend a party where everyone was wearing a mask. The tension eventually boiled over into a very public, very nasty war of words that lasted for decades. The most famous shot fired came from Lars Ulrich, who has never been known for keeping his mouth shut. During an awards show in the late 90s, Lars famously called out Motley Crue for allegedly using backing tracks and lip-syncing during their live performances. For a band like Metallica, who prides themselves on every mistake and every raw note being 100% live, this was the ultimate insult. Lars basically told the world that the Crue were a glorified karaoke act. This didn't sit well with Nikki Sixx, the bassist and mastermind of the Crue, who responded by calling Lars a fat, balding drummer and telling him to worry about his own band's declining sound. But for James Hetfield, the hate was always more about the lifestyle and the message. James grew up as a blue-collar kid with a lot of internal demons, and he found salvation in the raw power of the riff. When he looked at Tommy Lee and Vince Neil, he didn't see fellow musicians. He saw pretty boys who were more concerned with the pyrotechnics and the groupies than the craft of songwriting. There's a famous story of James and Lars mocking the glam lifestyle by being intentionally messy and ugly just to spite the polished LA scene. They didn't want the fame if it meant they had to look like dolls. This rivalry defined the 80s. You were either a thrasher or a poser, and in Metallica's eyes, Motley Crue was the king of the posers. To be fair to Motley Crue, their career was built on the very excess that Metallica despised. They were the bad boys of the strip, and they lived a life of such cartoonish debauchery that it's a miracle they are still alive today. Their memoir, The Dirt, chronicles a level of substance use and chaos that would make most people shiver. But that was their brand. While Metallica was in the garage, perfecting the complex time signatures of Master of Puppets, the Crue was busy redefining the rock star archetype for a generation of MTV viewers. They were the soundtrack to the party, while Metallica was the soundtrack to the revolution. The two were never meant to get along. As the 90s rolled in and grunge killed off most of the hair metal bands, Metallica survived and thrived, which only intensified the friction. The Crue struggled to find their footing in a world that suddenly valued realness over showmanship, and they likely felt the sting of Metallica's constant jabs. Even when both bands became elder statesmen of the rock world, the peace treaty was never fully signed. Every few years, a journalist would ask Nikki Sixx about Metallica, or ask James about the Crue, and the snark would start all over again. It's one of the longest-running feuds in rock history because it's based on a fundamental disagreement about what music is supposed to be. This wasn't just a beef between two bands, it was a battle for the identity of heavy metal itself, and Metallica made sure they were the ones left standing with their integrity intact. By the time the dust settled, Metallica had proven that you didn't need the hairspray to conquer the world, but they never missed an opportunity to remind the Crue that they hadn't forgotten the lip-sync scandal. It was a rivalry born in the clubs of LA and settled on the global stage, leaving a trail of broken glass and snide remarks in its wake. Mustaine's Shadow. The rivalry between Metallica and Megadeth isn't just a tour issue. It's arguably the most famous family feud in the history of heavy metal. To understand why James Hetfield found touring with Megadeth so exhausting, you have to go back to April 1983, when a young, intoxicated Dave Mustaine was handed a bus ticket and fired from Metallica before they even recorded their debut album. From that moment on, Mustaine made it his life's mission to outshred his former bandmates, creating a competitive atmosphere that made any shared festival bill or tour date feel like an awkward Thanksgiving dinner with an ex who still wants to fight. For James, touring anywhere near Megadeth meant dealing with Dave's intense, brooding energy and a constant sense of being watched by a man who felt he was the rightful heir to the Metallica throne. When they did cross paths on the road, most notably during European dates in the early 90s and later during the Big Four stadium shows, the tension was thick enough to cut with a Gibson Explorer. Unlike other bands who might enjoy a beer backstage, Metallica and Megadeth operated in separate spheres. James has admitted in interviews that for years, the Dave problem was a dark cloud. Every time Dave gave a press conference claiming he wrote all the best riffs on Kill 'Em All, or every time he tried to one-up Metallica's stage production, it added another layer of resentment. To James, the hate wasn't necessarily about the music. He's actually praised Megadeth's technicality. It was about the psychological weight of Mustaine's 3-decade-long grudge. It's hard to have a good time on tour when your peer is looking at you like you stole his winning lottery ticket. The dynamic was uniquely lopsided. While Metallica became a global pop culture phenomenon, Dave Mustaine turned Megadeth into a lean, mean, technical machine, fueled almost entirely by his desire to prove Metallica wrong. This made for some incredible music, but it made for miserable touring. On the road, Dave was known for being a perfectionist and a difficult personality, often clashing with tour crews and other bands. James, who was dealing with his own demons and eventually sought treatment for alcohol addiction, found that Dave's chip on the shoulder was a trigger for the very type of negativity he was trying to escape. In the documentary Some Kind of Monster, we finally saw the two icons sit down for a heart-to-heart, and it became clear that the conflict had deeply wounded both men. Dave felt erased. James felt stalked by a ghost. Despite the personal drama, Megadeth's career is one of the most impressive revenge stories in music history. After being kicked out of Metallica, Mustaine didn't just fade away. He formed a band that would go on to sell 38 million albums and earn 12 Grammy nominations. Megadeth became the thinking man's thrash band, known for complex arrangements and politically charged lyrics that were often more sophisticated than Metallica's early output. Albums like Peace Sells, But Who's Buying, and Rust in Peace are undisputed masterpieces that forced Metallica to stay on their toes. Even though James found the personal interaction draining, the rivalry actually benefited the fans. It created a Cold War of metal where both bands were constantly trying to build a bigger, faster musical weapon. As the years progressed, the hate began to soften into a weary mutual respect, but the scars never fully disappeared. During the Big Four tours in 2010 and 2011, there were moments of public reconciliation, like when Dave joined Metallica on stage to play Phantom Lord. Yet, even then, fans noticed the body language. James was the benevolent king. Dave was the warrior who still looked like he wanted to reclaim the crown. James has noted that even in their 50s and 60s, there's an edge to Dave that never quite dulls. For a guy like Hetfield, who just wants to play his riffs and go home to his family, that level of intensity can be a lot to handle over a long tour. Megadeth's legacy is inextricably tied to Metallica, which is exactly what Mustaine spent his whole career trying to avoid. They are the satanic counterpart to Metallica's everyman vibe. While Metallica was playing to 100,000 people in Moscow, Megadeth was in the studio perfecting the most intricate guitar solos ever recorded in the genre. Dave's technical prowess is undeniable, and his ability to keep Megadeth relevant through dozens of lineup changes is a testament to his sheer willpower. But that same willpower is what made him such a hated touring partner for the Metallica camp. He wasn't just there to play, he was there to win. It was a tour pairing that produced some of the greatest metal shows in history. But for the men involved, it was a grueling... By the time they reached the Big Four era, they were finally able to stand in the same room without a riot breaking out. But the ghost of 1983 still lingers in the corner of every stadium they share. If the tension with Megadeth was like a never-ending family feud, Metallica's next great tour disaster was a total culture clash with the baggy pants, red hat-wearing world of nu metal. Limp Bizkit, the nu metal culture clash. In 2003, the Summer Sanitarium tour was supposed to be a victory lap for Metallica, but instead, it felt like a midlife crisis caught on film. To understand why James Hetfield and the guys found touring with Limp Bizkit so grating, you have to look at where Metallica was at the time. They were just emerging from the most turbulent period in their history. James had just spent a year in rehab, they had no permanent bassist, and they were recording the raw, painful, and widely mocked Saint Anger. Meanwhile, Limp Bizkit was the undisputed king of the frat boy metal scene, led by Fred Durst, a man who essentially turned being annoying into a multi-million-dollar business model. For the old-school thrash purists in the Metallica camp, sharing a stage with Durst felt like the ultimate sellout moment, a desperate attempt to stay relevant in a world that suddenly cared more about turntables and red baseball caps than complex guitar solos. The friction on this tour wasn't just behind the scenes, it was right there in the front row. Metallica fans were notoriously hostile toward the nu metal movement, viewing it as a shallow corporate perversion of the genre they loved. In cities like Chicago, the thing became physical. Fred Durst was met with a literal wall of booze and showered with water bottles and garbage from the moment he stepped on stage. Durst, never one to de-escalate, responded by insulting the crowd and Chicago itself, eventually cutting the set short after just a few songs. For James Hetfield, who was trying to maintain his sobriety and a new Zen outlook on life, the chaotic, negative energy of the Limp Bizkit camp was the opposite of what he needed. While Lars Ulrich occasionally played along, even joining Bizkit on drums for a few songs, James remained noticeably distant, clearly unimpressed by the nookie-fueled circus. The career of Limp Bizkit is one of the most polarizing arcs in rock history. They were the fastest-rising band of the late 90s, selling millions of copies of Significant Other and Chocolate Starfish and the hot dog-flavored water. They were the face of the Woodstock '99 disaster, a band that leaned into the white trash and proud aesthetic so hard it eventually became a parody. By the time they toured with Metallica in 2003, the wheels were already falling off. Guitarist Wes Borland, the only member of the band Metallica's crew actually seemed to respect for his technical skill, had quit. The band was trying to promote Results May Vary, an album that was being torn apart by critics. For Metallica, who were already having their own identity crisis, being associated with a band that was rapidly becoming the Nickelback of metal was a major blow to their street cred. To be fair, Fred Durst was a marketing genius who knew exactly how to push people's buttons. He grew up as an outsider in Florida, a tattoo artist who combined hip-hop rhythms with heavy riffs to create something that spoke to a massive, disaffected suburban audience. But his ego was legendary, and his constant feuds, with everyone from Trent Reznor to Slipknot, made him a liability on the road. James Hetfield, who had spent 20 years building Metallica into a respectable institution, couldn't wrap his head around Durst's "I'm the king of the world" attitude, especially when it was backed by what James considered to be subpar musicianship. In the Some Kind of Monster documentary, you can almost feel the awkwardness in the air whenever the new guard of metal is mentioned. The Summer Sanitarium tour ultimately marked the end of an era for both bands. For Limp Bizkit, it was the beginning of a long decline into hiatus and punchline status before their eventual ironic resurgence decades later. For Metallica, it was a wake-up call. They realized that trying to fit in with the new metal crowd was a mistake. They had abandoned their guitar solos and their signature sound to chase a trend that was already dying. The friction with Fred Durst and the hostility of the fans helped push Metallica back toward their roots. It's no coincidence that their next album, Death Magnetic, was a return to long, complex thrash epics. They had seen the alternative, a world of red hats and rap rock, and they decided it wasn't for them. Looking back at Limp Bizkit's career today, there's a strange kind of nostalgia for their "don't give a damn" energy. They were the soundtrack to a very specific, very loud moment in time. But as a touring partner for Metallica, they were a disaster. The mismatch between Metallica's serious artist phase and Limp Bizkit's frat boy riot phase created a tension that made every show feel like a ticking time bomb. James Hetfield, at 66, probably looks back on that 2003 tour as one of the weirdest summers of his life, a time when he was fighting for his life and his band, while Fred Durst was busy fighting with a stadium full of people who just wanted to hear Master of Puppets. It was a cultural car crash that neither band emerged from unscathed, but it proved once and for all that you can't force two different worlds to collide just because the record label thinks it will sell tickets. The final entry in Metallica's history of touring friction takes us back to 1988, when a sophisticated, intellectual mismatch turned a massive arena run into a strange and sometimes literal pissing contest. Queensryche, the vibe disconnect. In the late 80s, Metallica was in a state of hyper-aggressive transition. They were touring behind And Justice for All, an album defined by its cold, complex, and bass-light production, and they were officially becoming the biggest heavy metal band on the planet. To fill the opening slot for the massive Damaged Justice tour, they tapped Queensryche, a band that was essentially the antithesis of everything Metallica stood for at the time. While Metallica was the alcoholica machine, fueled by beer and raw thrash energy, Queensryche was a highly polished, intellectual prog metal outfit that had just released the rock opera masterpiece Operation Mindcrime. This wasn't a feud born of hatred for each other's talent. It was a fundamental vibe disconnect that made the road feel like two different planets sharing the same map. For James Hetfield, who was at his most anti-bullshit phase in 1988, Queensryche represented a level of theatricality that felt alien. While James was out there in a sweat-stained black t-shirt screaming about the corruption of the justice system, Queensryche frontman Jeff Tate was delivering operatic, high-concept vocals with a level of precision that felt almost too clean for the Metallica crowd. The friction wasn't just musical, it was social. The Metallica camp was legendary for their Animal House backstage behavior, while the Queensryche guys were perceived as being more reserved and professional. This led to a series of legendary pranks and hazing rituals that eventually made the tour famous for all the wrong reasons, including the persistent story of Lars Ulrich being a serial urinator who would drunkenly mark his territory on the Queensryche tour bus. The fans, however, were the ones who truly felt the friction. Metallica's audience in the late 80s was a feral beast. They were there to destroy their necks and push the walls of the arena down. When Queensryche would take the stage to play their intricate, story-driven songs, they were often met with a wall of hostility. Jeff Tate has since recalled stories of being pelted with shoes, garbage, and even full vodka bottles by fans who simply wanted Metallica to start playing. In Helsinki, a bottle shattered against guitarist Michael Wilton's instrument mid-solo. For James, watching his opening act get treated like a target range was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it proved his fans were the most loyal in the world, but on the other, it made for a tense and uncomfortable working environment for months on end. To understand why this pairing was so difficult, you have to look at the massive career trajectory of Queensryche at that moment. They weren't just some local opening band. They were on the verge of becoming superstars in their own right. Operation Mindcrime is still regarded as one of the greatest concept albums of all time, a sprawling narrative about revolution and brainwashing that predated Green Day's American Idiot by nearly 2 decades. They were a band of incredible technical skill, with guitarists Chris DeGarmo and Michael Wilton creating a dual lead attack that was every bit as complex as what James and Kirk were doing. But while Metallica was leaning into the ugly side of thrash, Queensryche was aiming for the majestic side of prog rock. They were two bands headed for the same mountain peak, but taking completely different paths. The hate in this section is perhaps the most nuanced because it was born of a lack of common ground. James has admitted that he found the theatrical nature of the Mindcrime era to be a bit too much for his tastes. In the early days, Metallica prided themselves on having no gimmicks. Even their elaborate Justice stage set, with the crumbling statue of Lady Justice, was seen by the band as a literal representation of their lyrics rather than theater. Queensryche, with their synchronized movements and operatic high notes, felt like the kind of showbiz that Metallica was trying to kill. It was a mismatch of philosophies, the blue-collar thrashers versus the high-art intellectuals. The career of Queensryche following that tour was a whirlwind of massive success, followed by a tragic internal implosion. They followed up the Metallica run with Empire, which featured the massive hit Silent Lucidity and propelled them into the stratosphere. For a few years, they were one of the biggest bands in the world, proving that their sophisticated approach to metal had a global audience. However, as the 90s wore on and the grunge movement changed the landscape, the band struggled to maintain their identity. Internal tensions eventually led to a messy legal battle over the band's name, resulting in a split that saw Jeff Tate exit the group. It was a sad ending for a band that had once stood toe-to-toe with the giants of the genre. The struggle with Queensryche wasn't about malice. It was about the fact that you can't put a philosopher in a mosh pit and expect everyone to get along. It remains one of the most interesting footnotes in Metallica's history. A 100-show run where the greatest thrash band in the world shared the stage with the Kings of Prague, resulting in a summer of flying bottles, ruined tour bus carpets, and a definitive realization that Metallica was a force that no opening act could ever truly hope to match. By the time they finished that tour, Metallica didn't just have a new fan base. They had the scars of a band that had survived the most mismatched pairing in metal history. If you want more deep dives into the chaotic history of the legends who built the metal scene, subscribe to the channel now.